My name is Arias Dare. I'm the Director of Communications here at the Korea Economic Institute of America. We have a really interesting discussion today, and this is off of a paper that's going to be featured in our next edition of Korea Policy, which is due out in early June. Now, I recognize some of you here, and I saw on the online RSVP list that we have a number of people that have come to some past talks that I've had the opportunity to moderate, some panels that I've been able to share stage with. Those were mostly security focused. This is going to be something new, and I think still something extremely important, especially given the events of the last several weeks here in Washington, and that is industrial policy. That's sort of a vague and perhaps nebulous sort of concept, but I'm really fortunate here to have Dr. Lee sort of walk us through what he means by industrial policy and why we should really be paying attention to this under the new Trump administration and in advance of a new South Korean administration as well. So let's get to this. I'll just read a brief introduction and then I will give the stage to Dr. Lee. Dr. Sunhyung Lee is a non-resident fellow at the Korea Economic Institute and an assistant professor of economics at Montclair State University. Before joining academia, he served as an associate research fellow at the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy. There he contributed to policymaking on global economic issues from 2020 to 2021. Dr. Lee conducts applied and policy-relevant research on international economics, specializing in foreign direct investment, global value chains, multinational enterprises, and emerging trade and industrial policies. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Oklahoma and a bachelor's degree in economics and international business management from Dickinson College. So we'll get to it. Dr. Lee.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Arias, for moderating this event, and I want to appreciate KIEP for organizing this event and having us at great hospitality. So what I mean by the industry policy, well, before we get started, I want to make sure and give you a full disclosure. The deadline for this paper was April 1st, a day before the Liberation Day. So everything I wrote here is probably 2 weeks old, so very outdated element of it. At the same time, whatever we discuss today might not be relevant in the next 2 weeks or so. But with the levity aside, the point I'm trying to make here is that there has been an increase in economic policy uncertainty in this entire global economy, and that's the key factor driving this policy decisions today. I have another work in the second round of revision at the Journal of International Economics about the multinational corporations' economic and investment activity under uncertainty, especially for the hosting and competing countries. To give you a perspective on that, imagine that we have 3-country framework. Let's say you have US, China, and Korea. And what we have found from 2003 to 2021 was that because of the China's increased economic policy uncertainty since 2015, investment from US firms to Korea increased. So nothing has ever happened about the Korean uncertainty, but because of this spillover effect, that was the big driver in that policy making. Now, unfortunately, in 2025, the key driver here is now the US economy and the uncertainty surrounding the trade policies moving forward. So now US is replacing this role here in terms of who is the key driver and the source of the economic policy uncertainty. And so to combat against those realities, firms are trying to do something, obviously, and at the same time, we also have policymakers trying to struggle and navigate through this idea of, okay, what should we do about these tariffs and tariff threats, really? And so the idea is that what type of industrial policies can be used. I guess that's kind of the goal of this talk. And to do that, we need to look at the framework of the industrial policy history, the reframing from the negative to positive aspect. And once we go through the historical background, then we can discuss why and what types of trend that we're seeing in this new environment. And finally, we can talk about some of the implications for Korea and the US-Korea relationship. So that would be the overview of this paper. And so let's starting with this rebranding of the industrial policy. As everyone here knows, the industrial policy export-led growth for Japanese and Korean economy was the big issue in the 70s and 80s, although it was a little bit controversial in terms of the cost efficiency, whether how good is the government in driving all these decisions. At the same time, it's unfairness under the WTO regime about the trading partners are not benefiting from these industrial policies, and many countries could not replicate what Korea or Japan could do using these policies. Then COVID came in 2020 with deglobalization and more of an inward policies of using industrial policies to get out of pandemic. So what I found from the data was that from 2014 to 2019, on average, there was about 3,500 global industrial policies. But after that, in 2020, there was over 7,000 policies. That's a lot. And another key factor was in 2022, during the Biden administration, we had a big increase in the scale, also the frequency of the industrial policies moving forward, including the CHIPS Act or the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, being the key driver there, where we see that Korean firms and many other firms are trying to invest in the US based on this narrative of national security. Now everything is about national security, and under that umbrella, anything can be done. And that really is the new framework of the industrial policy, meaning that you can name import tariffs, you can name state subsidies, financial grant, tax release, anything can be done under that umbrella. And if you were to try that into international court, we've seen evidence that national security reasoning has worked a lot. So that this unfairness is no longer the key restrictions in this, pursuing the industrial policies. So the economists are now, easing into this idea that, okay, maybe industrial policies could be useful in national security. Also, some discussions about the green technology and green transition and climate change, although that's not really the focus these days. But so I want to focus on the national security element of it. So from the data, it's difficult to really monitor what's going on around the world. Korea has multiple, US has multiple, and China has multiple. So the main data source we use here is that the Global Trade Alert database, where they can track everything on a daily to monthly basis. And from there, we see that since 2022, United States is the #1 country with the industrial policies, over 2,270 policies in terms of frequency. Where does Korea rank? We rank about 30. Korea ranks about 36 in that list. So you start with the United States, followed by China. Then surprisingly, we have Brazil, Australia, Italy, and France on the top 10 list, Korea on the 36, and Japan on the 38. So while the frequency does not mean the scale of each policy, maybe Korea has billions of dollars in one policy, everything there with the more targeted approach. But the idea is that there is an increase in industrial policies from advanced nations like the United States. And so that would drive the entire investment and trade activities moving forward. And so when we look at different policy instruments that these countries use, it used to be the financial grant and state aid. Now, the second on the list for the most popular instrument is the import tariffs. So now we can see that import tariff is part of the industrial policy, and many countries are using that. At the same time, we see a rise of the place-based or localization, where we want to focus on the regional growth of it. So many countries are also looking at that aspect as well. From this trend, I'm trying to compare the traditional model of the industrial policy and then with the new industrial policies moving forward, a new framework that we can look at. For example, the industrial policy of yesterday really focused on the market failures of the, what the firms are not doing, R&D, innovations, and technology. Now, with the new framework, that might be still true, but we are now more focused on the technology and innovations and automation in that sector. So there has been that agreement of what the government's role should be. And at the same time, there has been this new consensus that the government cannot know everything about everything. What that means is that before, industrial policy was based on the assumption that government could do and identify the problem and then come up with the policies or the solutions, and that would be a perfect thing for the market. However, now because of this rise of competition, geopolitical fragmentation, and so on, government does not have the complete information on this issue, and so we need to acknowledge that. So how do we get that information? Well, right now, with the new framework, we need to look at this more of a collaborative environment between the government and the firms so that we can look at and hear the needs of the firms. It's no longer the top-down approach where the government announces that, okay, we're going to do something and you should follow that. And in that regard, we need to also look at how the funds are distributed. Imagine that the subsidy is the most popular way of looking at giving out this help. Then, if that's the case, usually they have a fixed schedule of payment, maybe every semi-annual or annual payment of that, but now maybe it should be more of a customized role on that issue of whenever they need it, we should be able to help them out. And then we also get into look at which sector should we focus on. Obviously for Korea, it was manufacturing. And now we need to look into more of a broader industry spectrum of service. Service has become an important role where the business services, legal services, maybe it's the language barriers, maybe it's the cultural restrictions, whatever that may be, that firms need that help. And so we need to look at the service element of this industry policies moving forward in this new framework of it all. So those were really the main key identifiers of what's happening in the new world. And so from that, okay, what can we do for the implications for the South Korean economy and the collaboration between the two countries? Well, as everyone here knows, if you look at the reality of the policies, Korea will have a new administration on June 3rd, I believe, and then you will have the just incoming president in the United States. So any decisions right now is not going to be really have any long-term impact. And what that means is the firms are right now doing wait-and-see approach, most likely, because what they hate is the reversing these investment decisions. It's not lightly taken where Hyundai announces $7 billion several years in Louisiana. It's a long-term investment, and they've been talking about it for a while. And so imagine that these threats are coming every single day for the last few weeks. Firms cannot just do this overnight. So as you can see, let's say they maybe wait 30 days, 60 days, or 90 days, depending on just the number of, I guess, the breaks that we're getting so far. So that's there. And at the same time, well, then what can we do in terms of the policy? So I want to look at something more of a long-term policy that's not really being affected by the changes of administration. For example, I can give a good example of this. When I was working for KIEP back in 2020, New Southern Policy was the biggest driver in terms of the how that we can decouple from Chinese influence of the COVID and all that. However, then we realized, okay, so maybe there is trade relationship, language, and culture, all that. However, with the change of administration, that really didn't follow through. But there's a lot of misallocation of resources because of stopping the policy. You can also think about the US, Korea, Japan trilateral agreement that just happened last year, right? And so I remember I was in a seminar in Frankfurt for this US, Korea, Japanese seminar. You might be asking why I was in Germany. Well, because we're looking for more of a super block of, okay, so maybe what can the Europe do in terms of all this in this three trilateral agreement? But the reality is, I don't think that's continuing anytime soon with all change of the old leaders to new leaders. So we need some kind of continuation. So what could that be? Well, one thing we can look at is the automation process. Whenever the countries, whether the United States or Korea, can involve in this type of automation technology, that can be a long-term investment. For example, China has this thing called the Made in China 2025 initiative that was announced in 2015. Since then, the new industrial robot adoptions has significantly increased for the Chinese share, and so they're number one, and they have over 50% of the new shares in the global. Korea, Japan, and Germany are all really the 2, 3, and 4 on the list, but we are way below that. And Korea actually is not adopting as many robots as any other countries are doing. So there's something to talk about. Obviously, that now that brings into question about the disappearance of the middle class and the labor issues. That also has to be also involved with these policy coordination. So something like that. At the same time, we need to look at this reality of the global value chains. We want to reduce the global value chains, and that was really the focus of the Biden administration about the de-risking factor. We moved from decoupling to de-risking, whether we cannot eliminate one side of the factor, now we are trying to reduce that factor. And one of the things we can do is obviously, I mentioned the technological change. The second one could be the preparing for the natural disasters. That's the one thing I also want to focus on here, where, okay, these funds, unfortunately, natural disasters will happen, right? And no matter what the administration might be, if we have some kind of coordination in okay, this is a long-term fund, long-term allocation, then we may be able to have something going on. The idea is this: government policies are very expensive. And reversing the policy is also very inefficient for the society, which negates the benefits of industrial policies in the first place. And so we need a continuation of the policies, and we need some way of coordination of how we can manage this throughout. And finally, I do want to touch upon this U.S.-Korea relationship. And I want to remain optimistic about this entire situation at least for the next 4 years, as the firms are trying to drive this relationship and governments trying to negotiate the deals. And the idea is that if the goal of, let's say, two countries is to balance out the Chinese influence and all that, I think we need more collaboration, not less, in terms of, the agreements. And we can remember, if you remember, we have all these agreements from TPP to CPTPP to RCEP, and all those things back in this, in the Pacific challenges. I can use all the acronyms I can think of. That was the deal, but I'm not saying that was the good solution, but we need more of a super block approach if you want to really address that issue. So moving forward, industrial policy is really used in a loose term. And given what's going on in the world, whatever you design, it's going to be met with less pushback than before with the Korean controversy related to the export growth policy. So I did want to talk about that in this new evolving context, and hopefully this has some relevance moving forward in the next few weeks at least.
Excellent. So you mentioned a couple of times, you sort of draw this line between traditional industrial policy and what you're observing now in the 2020s. I don't know if you want to call it neo-industrial policy. We'll figure out a nice name when we publish our career policy journal. But reading your paper, I was struck by, I think this is a sort of a classic textbook case now when studying Asian economies. Just a quick poll here. Can anybody name a Korean car company? Hyundai, Kia. Right, I think most Americans would be able to tell you Hyundai, Kia. Right, these are world-class brands with cutting-edge technology, lots of different models for whatever lifestyle you're in. Now, who can name a Malaysian automobile? Proton? Proton, right? Perodea. What's super interesting about Proton specifically is that it started around the same time that Hyundai and Kia did. Only one of these vehicles is world renowned. Only one of these brands is sort of setting the standard for the auto industry. The other is really confined to one particular geographic area. And why is that the case? Well, it comes down to industrial policy. Okay? South Korea benchmarked a lot of its early table or a lot of its early sort of star industries against exports. Right? This was sort of one of the main pillars that South Korea did in the 70s and 80s and 90s to ensure that it could meet the quality standards of the global market. Right? This is one of the big drivers of South Korea's economic success in the 20th century. So if you wanted to call that a traditional industrial policy, how does that approach differ? Does export benchmarking still play a major role for South Korean industrial policy in the 2020s?
Yes, it does. And when I distinguish this old or traditional versus neo, as you were to put it, doesn't mean that we need to give up on the traditional way of looking at these things. We're talking about the new or better or let's say more comprehensive framework. When we went to this manufacturing push, whether it's the steel or the automobile, whether electronics, we have Samsung, Hyundai, and you have obviously other steel companies that are trying to be the main driver, and so was the shipbuilding industry as well. On top of that, the NEO framework is doing anything else that we can do related to service or technology or any other sectors that need that push. And it used to be met with some pushback, that's not fair, from other trading partners. And now you can really design anything with the national security umbrella. And now you could argue that technology is probably the primary factor in national security, the critical elements of that. And so we are talking about it as more of a complementary push, not that we're just giving up or just ignoring the one side. It should be that when the government looks at this, obviously every year the Ministry of Industry will know that manufacturing is the key focus. But the NEO one, meaning the newer policy framework, should consider those needs of the firms because they need those as well. And at the same time, it used to be that only multinational corporations like Hyundai was the beneficiary of those policies. But now the NEO firms should include the small and medium-sized enterprises in that regard because they are really the pillars of these manufacturing processes as well. And we're realizing that as we went through COVID, we went through China, US-China trade war, and today.
You've got these really interesting data sets that you put together for your paper. I'm wondering, when you were sort of planning this, was there some assumptions that you expected to find? You're looking at the numbers and you're saying, yeah, I think that these numbers are going to paint this particular story. But then actually crunching the numbers and writing this, sort of working through the data, was there something that surprised you or that was a little bit different than what you expected?
Yeah, one thing was, I mentioned the example of Brazil and Australia being on the top of the third and fourth on the list of the number of industry policies they're actually implementing, whereas Korea was ranked 36 on that list of the frequency since 2022, which means that, okay, maybe Korea is more of a sector focused, very specific, and maybe one project, as I mentioned before, was really large in scale, whereas maybe Brazil and Australia, as you see, it's the agriculture-focused economy, soybeans, LNG gas, all that. So basically, we're seeing that these things are quite divided. So maybe not the number is important, maybe it's the scale. We don't know what would be a good mix of it, but it's something to think about when we move forward with this assumption, is that maybe if you remember the scale of CHIPS or the IRA, it's very big. Right? And are we comparing that as a one tariff decision? So that's kind of what we're doing here. And so we need to have some kind of weight when we discuss these policies, frequencies.
Now, under the Biden administration, a big part of what they were emphasizing was this sort of public-private partnership. Obviously, you mentioned the IRA, you mentioned the CHIPS Act. This is probably the loudest sort of platform for that. But it happened in other areas as well. If you look at the messaging out of the Biden administration, they were really emphasizing that, look, the government can only meet you so much. You need to at least meet us halfway. And together with public and private sort of partnership, ingenuity, innovation, we can sort of reach this higher plane. In this industrial policy that you're envisioning going forward, how much of a role does the public-private partnership play?
I think it's paramount that there has to be a collaboration between this government and firm association. I think Korea did very well so far, where there is always some kind of a platform where the government, policymakers, and the firms are meeting up together. And so I think we're doing that, but I think we need maybe more of that because the demands are different. When you look at this, needs of these services, when I mentioned the marketing, the training of these people, and when you look at this automation issue, I think that's the biggest part. Where so suppose Hyundai wants to automate their plant. Could you imagine the backlash of the political, all the everything moving forward, whether it's in Korea, whether it's in different countries? And so those are really key aspects of it. And I think we may have neglected it, meaning that it used to be other policies was top-down, like if you mentioned the 70s and 80s, but we gradually moved towards more collaboration, and moving forward, maybe we need more collaboration moving forward.
So I think it's easy to be pessimistic about global trade, particularly from our vantage point in mid-April 2025. But I like what you said during your presentation about, these are very long-term trends that you can't actually change too much within just a few weeks or even a few years. You also mentioned that you were optimistic for the future of South Korea-U.S. Economic collaboration and the trade partnership. What gives you hope? After going through this research, why are you optimistic?
Well, at least for the geography of it all, U.S. and Korea has a very strategic relationship. I don't have to go into but the neighboring with China and North Korea and all that. So they still need strategic alliances. So moving forward, what is the driver in that? Really, that was the economic relations between the two and economic ties. So I think we still have intricate relationship of the U.S. firms in Korea and Korean firms in the United States. And given those, bottom-up approach, you will still have connections. And we are sitting here today with this more of intellectual discussions too. So I don't see that two countries becoming hostile. And history tells us that we are more of a needed partners than a really divorced relationship.
One more question before we turn it over to the audience. You mentioned this super bloc, South Korea, and you mentioned Germany, but recently China, South Korea, and Japan met, and they talked about RCEP. They also talked about, they alluded to, the three sides have been alluding to an FTA for decades at this point, so we don't know how committed they are, but they did allude to a three-party FTA. Do you see greater Chinese, South Korean, and Japanese collaboration going forward in the trade space over the next half decade?
Yeah, next half decade, that's a long time horizon, I'm sure, yes. I think we need it, maybe we are pushing for it. And if you're really looking for a time to do it, right now might be the best time to do it because of this, so much is going on here. Maybe people are not even focused on this issue as much. So obviously, we need to consider the domestic repercussions of the protecting the agriculture industry in South Korea and different aspect of the middle class. But maybe this is a good time to start talking about that. But we don't know what the new administration's goal will be in South Korea, so we have to wait and see. Possibly Japan very soon at the same time. So, and then you have an election in 2 years in the United States. So we don't know yet, but whatever that may be, it's always worth talking about. And if you look, there's really never a perfect time, but this might be a good time to do it.
Dr. Lee, thank you. I've got a bunch more questions. I can keep on going, but I'll pause here and turn it over to the audience. For those of you watching online, please use the live chat feature to input any questions. But first, anybody here, if they have a question? Randall, yes.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation. I guess I have doubts about industrial policy. Looking at Korea's history, industrial policy played a positive role, but now we're in a difficult situation because of the legacy structure of industrial policy. We have the SMEs in Korea, the small and medium size, are very unproductive, very inefficient. The service sector is very backward, and we have a very modern manufacturing sector. So this is the legacy from industrial policy. So how do we get out of it? Now we have industrial policy focused on SMEs. Last time I looked, there's 1,646 government programs to help the SMEs. And nevertheless, they keep falling further behind. Productivity in a small company is only about 35% of a big company. So if you look at these policies we're pursuing, industrial policy, it's not working. And the SMEs are getting further behind. And there have been some studies where you look at SMEs that get government support and those that don't. And the companies that don't get the government support do better in terms of productivity than those that do get government support. And so from my perspective, industrial policy is a problem that's actually delaying the progress that we need to see in other parts of the economy besides the chaebol, the big manufacturing.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's, as I mentioned, it's a transition of the perspective of what the industrial policy is. 70s, 80s, and 90s, still, the industrial policy is really the taboo subject for economists. We believe that, well, at least a lot of academic literature believe that it's a very inefficient way of looking at it. And to give an example of this China shipbuilding industry, as you're very well aware of, from 2006 to 2010, there was an abundance of small firms in China trying to build ships, and they realized that that's very inefficient. And so they got rid of all of that, and now they only focused on very efficient firms. Now then, that gets to discussion about the agglomeration of these firms. And Korea is good with that, with all that, multinational corporations in Korea. So we have that aspect of that as well. Now the question becomes about this free market driving the inefficient players out of it, and now we only focused on the efficient aspect of it. And I think what people are realizing is that, like I mentioned before, the government cannot solve everything, and the market failure identification and this identity that, okay, government was omniscient, that's no longer the case. So maybe we need to look at which sectors that we should focus on. Maybe the SMEs that you were mentioning before, maybe they were heavily focused in electronics for the South Korean industries, most of them probably inefficient. Maybe should we look at a different sector? Maybe should we look at different identities to focus on for those industry policies? And from my perspective, I suggest maybe automation, which is probably prevalent for whether it's AI or it's the manufacturing that's needed. Preparing for the natural disasters, preparing for something more shock like pandemic. Those things are, I think, are really the role of the government moving forward under the umbrella of the industrial policy, in that sense, if that makes sense. So then they'll protect small and large firms. I think that's kind of the idea moving forward with this new framework.
Yes.
I'm Dr. Joshua Park, South Korean Navy retired captain and a fifth faculty George Mason. Thank you for hosting this wonderful event, KI. And I have two questions to Dr. Lee. This is more practical question. Then first question is, it's a hot topic, which is tariff policy. As you know, that April 2nd, President Trump announced 25% tariff to South Korea. Then what will be the appropriate South Korea strategy to negotiate with President Trump to decrease such a tariff rate? That is first question. Then second question will be sort of elephant in the room. Then that is uncertainty or inconsistency of current Trump administration policy. What do you think of administration policy of the economic policy of current Trump administration? If so, what kinds of strategy to manage South Korea's conglomerate company who want to business in the United States? Such inconsistency and uncertainty of current Trump administration policy. You know, Hyundai Motors, they decide to invest a lot of money to continent America, as well as Hanwha Philly Shipyard. They purchased $100 million to purchase Philly Shipyard already. Then they are concerned about such an inconsistency and uncertain policy. Thank you.
Yeah, I believe the first question is what can Korea do to negotiate with the U.S. Current administration. If I had the answer to that, I probably won't be here. But the formula, if you look at this 25% where it came from, if everyone here probably read that, it's that trade deficit between the U.S. and Korea divided by the import, right? And it was 50.2%. Then why is it 25%? Because President Trump felt more lenient about this, so he divided by 2. So that's kind of the logic behind it. So maybe we could present a better sensitivity parameters. These all came from the economics literature, whether it's from the Journal of International Economics or any other things, some of my colleagues. So that means that we could present more of the parameters. But the issue is the communicating these things are not that easy, and so that's kind of the big issue. So really, if you want to go more of a logical route, we all have the answers, but that's kind of difficult at the moment. And so that boils into your second question about, what the assessment of that. I don't think anybody knows at this point. It's very difficult. I don't think we should react to it every single day. In the end, I think Korean firms, like you mentioned, are making these decisions in reaction to this. At the same time, they've been thinking about this for a long time in reaction to the CHIPS Act and the IRA. So we need to look at this in the long-term solution. 4 years will pass, and my favorite quote these days is that technology trumps tariffs. So tariffs will either go away eventually, or at least minimize soon in the next few years, but technological progress and these investment projects will sustain for the next decade or so. And that's something that we should keep in mind while we are reacting to this new cycle that we can't really keep up with today.
Yes.
My name is Lisa Park. Nice to meet you, and thank you so much for the invitation as well. And I have one question regarding industry and national security. I think the national security definition makes all the uncertainty. And in your perspective, what kind of industry, because you have a better understanding probably than I'm a lawyer, and I work in Korea Development Bank for a very long time, so I have kind of an industry understanding, but what I see now is it's all because of national security, we say, but I think it's like makes very this uncertain, vague term. What kind of industry is like more important? I think probably you have the idea what kind of industry is probably more targeted or less targeted, or do you have like kind of a view or understanding about it? Yes.
Yeah, I don't have the list. I'm sorry. I'm not in a good position to have a list, or nobody I don't think knows. But let's say some sectors is probably less critical than others. I guess that's one way to put it. Korea has been focused on the electronics, automobiles as the 2 key sectors moving forward. Now, how do we bring that into the national security That's a very difficult question. But at the same time, we need to look at the critical elements. We talked about the rare earth mineral export controls from China to the United States. That will probably happen. I haven't followed that along yet, but that might be a big issue. But the thing is, with Korea, we don't really have that choice of controlling that. So for us, I think for this Korean, meaning the Korean firms, that may be related to manufacturing. At the same time, the service sectors are related to this. We mentioned this new advance of the formula and the technological skills and the innovation-driven really patents and intellectual properties may be really be on the list of these critical sectors. And whenever these things are used in any industries, maybe we can put that under the same umbrella. Because all industry, whether it's agriculture, manufacturing, electronics, shipping, they all use some sort of technology, and maybe that could be our argument moving forward. But I'm sorry, I don't have the list for you to give you. Yes, sorry.
You remind me of something. In your paper, you do mention this sort of reaction to Chinese state-directed development. I'm wondering, in that jump from, what was it, 3,500 or so industrial policies, we can talk about methodology a bit later, every academic's favorite part of the talk, to over 7,000 in just a few years. Very simply, how much of this is a reaction to China, and how much of this is instead this sort of new way of thinking about industrial policy?
Well, I think the China's role in this is rather minimal compared to what we think, because the 2020 figure about 7,000 was due to COVID-19. Everyone was going through that. And if, for example, for Korea, if you remember Hyundai, they couldn't get the wiring harness from China. It's not the China's fault, but it's because of the COVID, global value chains, and that's why we came up with all these resiliency policies and all different sort of the things. So we are looking at in terms of the how can we make sure to have a more flowing global value chains. I think that's the key factor, and I think China's risk is rather minimized at this point. Obviously, there are risks associated with that, so we don't deny that. But for the time being, that's not the driver in 2020. In 2020, and if you look at 2022, that's the U.S. side of moving forward with the CHIPS and IRA Act, with the national security. That's when we discussed the de-risking. That's the new word de-risking came, which changed from decoupling. So I think if you want to mention the role of China, then we do have China as the presence of the role when we make these policies. But that's about it, I think. Yes.
Thank you. There's a hand. Yes, Nils.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Nils here with KI. I have two questions for you as well, and sort of piggybacking a little bit of yours as well. So the first one is also relating to the negotiations, and specifically, Korea already has very low tariffs against the US through KORUS. 95% of goods are already completely free of tariffs, right? And by 2026, it will be an even greater percentage. So how does that position Korea in the negotiations with regards to industrial policy? Is that sort of where we'll have to see sort of concessions from Korea, if any are required for the negotiations, right? And then the second question is, let me, I wrote it down a little bit. Oh yes, so you mentioned the three-country framework in the beginning of your talk. So what are lessons in terms of uncertainty from that? I'm thinking from the perspective of including tariffs in US industrial policy, as you suggested as well. And so when we see this flip-flopping in policy, when we maybe are concerned about the future of IRA and CHIPS Acts, what lessons do you have from that three-country framework if we sort of flip it around and use those lessons to sort of think about investment influx into the US, trade with the US, and will other nations sort of gravitate towards the US as you know, it's the attention of the policy, or will it push countries away and business away from the US? So that's it from me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. In terms of the first question about the tariff rate of what Korea or US has on each other, we do know that US and Korea has an FTA agreement. So it's not really the issue of tariff. I think the key factor right now is the trade deficit, right? So if that's the case, one thing, just an easy solution is that to reduce the trade deficit. One way you can do is that we can buy like a big airplane or big military spending. So if Korea wants to have a more discussion about the economic security in the region, and say that we're going to have more military spending based on that, and we buy more, F-35, jets from the United States, which is worth billions of dollars. That might be a solution to reduce the trade deficit between the two countries. So really, the tariff rate is not the issue here. It's just that reducing the trade deficit. Once we do that, I mentioned this formula, it will drastically go down. So if you really want to focus on that, that could be one way of looking at that negotiation table. On your second question about the, what was the second question? I'm sorry.
About uncertainty.
Uncertainty. The uncertainty aspect is really interesting, how the host and competing nations are really affecting one another. One way the US, Korea, or Japan can attract more investment, what we found, is to reduce domestic uncertainty in their respective countries. So if the US reduces economic policy uncertainty, Korea does the same thing, Japan does the same thing, then most likely we will attract more investment because the rest of the world, their uncertainty are going up. So if that's the case, we can have these things where we have some discussions, and reducing this uncertainty might be the answer there instead of having a trade agreement of this trilateral. That's no longer really the key here. I think the key here is the individual country's ability to withstand any other external shocks, and how can they manage these domestic threats so that they can bring down these levels of uncertainty in the future.
A question online?
Right, thank you. We have two questions online. They're somewhat related, so I'll just put them out together. The first question is, securing and hiring skilled workers is a major challenge to some Korean companies when it comes to doing more business in the United States, which is often overlooked by the US government. What's your take on this? And separately, a second question asks, I was curious if there's a labor policy aspect that needs to be paired with industrial policy, and what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, those questions are very relatable, because the first question I mentioned, how can we help out the firms? So we talked about the service aspect of the firm, where we do need more training in Korea, where we need to work in terms of the language and the way that we speak to one another, in the culture aspect of it, so that if the goal of these SMEs or any other firms, they want to have more business in the United States, those skills are critical. And I mentioned that these industrial policies should target these initiatives, where we need to think about this job training aspect of it. How it's not just in getting a good score on the English test. It's really about how to interact and how do you bring out this culture of interactions. And for your second question about the labor policy, really when you talk about the automation and the robots and industrial robots adoptions, all in economics literature is about the implication for the labor policy. The middle class, the skilled laborers, skilled labor entrepreneurs. We see that the unskilled labor is going down, whereas the skilled entrepreneurs rate is going up. So we are seeing the shift and reallocation of the labor market. That will have a societal impact as well. And the point here with the industrial policy is that then these policies should target how can we alleviate it, or if you want to accelerate that process, then maybe you should go for that. If not, then we need to have a complementary labor policy, because then that's boiling down to the immigration policy and so on and so forth, which is a very complex issue. But yes, those have to be also complemented with what we're discussing today.
You mentioned this just now, and something that I was struck by that question was, in 50 years, South Korea will have a far smaller workforce if current trends hold. Many of us online and here in the room are familiar with South Korea's demographic challenges. So when we're talking about labor, we're talking about the ratio of skilled to unskilled labor. It seems that those numbers are going to hit a very different sort of plateau in just a generation. How are you thinking about that? And that might be a bit beyond the scope of this paper, but how do you think, let's say more broadly, Korean policymakers are trying to factor that in?
Yeah, it's not just the issue in Korea, it's also affecting the United States labor force and workforce here. So I was listening to a recent podcast by Paul Krugman. Everyone here knows about who he is, and his argument is that industrial policy, immigration is the only way for economic growth, and that's his perspective on that. What he means by that is that when we have more influx of people coming into our countries, then we can bring out this economic growth moving forward. Korea has a very more or less of a closed border. Obviously, immigration is not much of a friendly topic today, but at the same time, when you discuss the changing the ratio and the reality of it, then the focus on the manufacturing sector, maybe is that long-term and sustainable? That might be a big question there. And if we're replacing that with automation, really the US service export is actually surplus with the rest of the world, and Korea's share of the service industry is going up compared to the manufacturing. So we're seeing this transition of this importance of human capital and the entrepreneurship, and so then the question becomes, again, when we train these workforces and design these industrial policies under the idea of national security, the survivability of this labor force as well as the future of the country will depend on these shifts in the workforce. And therefore, maybe that's something to discuss, the role of these labor force and how the automation and technological and innovation-driven growth can be used in this comparative context. Again, these policies should not be affected by what the tariff announcements are happening in the next few weeks. These are the long-term investment that we should focus on now, so that regardless of changes of administration in Korea or in the United States, that will have a long-term impact.
I don't see any hands, so I will take the opportunity to ask another. So just to build off of, I think we can call it a more cynical take that Randall sort of posited here. You know, if I were to play devil's advocate and I say, you know, look, we should all read our Hayek, we should read our Milton Friedman, we should understand that the market should be the ultimate decider here. The invisible hand is going to ultimately be more effective in allocating resources than the government. The government should not be involved in picking winners and losers. What would you say to that sort of pushback, where they're actually de-emphasizing a industrial policy or any sort of belief that a bunch of men and women in a room can make these sort of decisions? Let the market decide. What would you say to that?
I totally agree with that sentiment. I don't have to say that, because all the way up to 2022, that was the consensus, the controversy, the inefficiency of the government policies. The government cannot fix everything, even if they could identify all these problems. We were very skeptical of the fact of this industrial policy. But then came this narrative of the national security. On top of that, we haven't discussed much today here, but the climate change and the different environment issues. Firms are not going to be the forefront in that matter. And if we believe as a society that these are two critical aspects of our society, then that's the role of the government in this interventionistic point of view. Obviously, we need to also have some kind of a monitoring and how we can make sure that these things are less efficient. But for the time being, we are using this industry policy in a different context than what we used to think about. And that's why I bring up this new idea of this neo-industrial policy framework where, okay, maybe when we discuss this industrial policy, we don't mean what we traditionally meant. Instead, we mean more of a path forward. And yes, I still believe that market should drive the thing. And firms are, I respect the firms' decisions, and they do in their best interest, and they're really good at it because they're under the competitive environment. So we are seeing that, and we will see that firms will do well and they will do in their best interest. But let's say if the country doesn't exist because of national security issues or because of natural disasters, then all these things are moot point. And therefore, that's why I want to see this guidance of industrial policy in that sector only, not the overall arching idea of the industrial policy in general.
Yes, Lauren.
Hi, I'm Lauren, communications intern here at KEI. I'm actually going back to Arias's earlier question because I'm personally struggling with the immigration part of South Korean government, and I was just wondering how can the government, because it is decreasing the demographics in Korea, and they really do need a new alternative to the labor force, and how would the government policies work? And it's also about a cultural thing because it's a very homogeneous society in Korea. How would the workforce people and the companies react to those changing matters? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. At the same time, I'm not the expert in that department. And again, if I had the answers to that, I wouldn't be sitting here, right? And so the idea is that the labor policy, especially for Korea, is quite close border, as you mentioned. We don't really, the Korea does not really accept much of the immigration, although there is a need for it. And so again, if our goal, and if we want to have a society where it's service-driven sector, then so be it. Then push the policy toward that. If not, if the manufacturing is the way, then maybe we use the outsourcing, offshoring as part of the solution. But as you can see, it's no longer the case. Then we have this automation issue there. So yeah, we'll have to think more about that. Maybe the next issue of the Korea policy can discuss that, and I'll join that then. But for the time being, that's yeah, something that we need to think more about.
Randall.
Yes, sir, yeah.
I don't want to be too much of a skeptic, but I
sorry.
guess I see a role for industrial policy,
Yes.
but it's more generic. So when I look at SMEs, the policy we have now, to me, is negative. It's making things worse. If we focus on providing digitalization help for small companies or the smart factory, and that's the generic approach that helps every SME that wants to, whatever sector, wherever they're located. And in terms of green growth, I mean, the key is to have a price on carbon. And we all know that if we want to change our problem with climate change, we have to put this price on carbon, either a carbon tax or an ETS. Well, in the US, that's impossible for political reasons. So industrial policy is the second best approach. We do all these little things, some work, some don't, waste a lot of money trying to get the same goal, but we need to take the fundamental step of changing the price on carbon. And that's very hard to do. So maybe industrial policy to me is a kind of a second best approach that tries to get the same results. And finally, when I looked at that database, and in the US, many of these interventions are firm specific. Well, that's what we used to call crony capitalism. Yes. I'm helping a specific firm, that leads to cronyism, corruption, what have you. So for me, this whole thing leads to a dangerous step towards involvement in specific firms and helping your friends and not helping your enemies. And finally, on national security, my first job after graduate school was the Council of Economic Advisors and the Reagan administration. And he was, in theory, a free trader, but he put in lots of barriers. And he put on a big tariff on steel on national security grounds. And that caused the people who make textiles to call for national security protection for textiles because soldiers need to have uniforms. Then the footwear people came in and said, we need to have boots for our soldiers, so we need protection on shoes so we can protect our national security. So for me, as you said, national security leads to 100% protection, and it shouldn't be taken seriously except by real experts who actually understand what are national security reasons.
Yeah, I agree with all your points there, and really the history repeats itself, and so it's nothing new that we're seeing here. And then this old mercantilistic view of we need to protect the domestic industry, and at the same time we need to impose tariffs so that we can have that. So yeah, that still lives, and we have this neo-mercantilistic view. That's what we're living through here. And obviously, Korea does not really have a firm-specific policy. At least what the data shows. Instead, we have all-sector policy, although we only have few, companies within the sector. So that's kind of the how it works for Korea. So obvious lobbying, the research using procedures, all those things are playing a role. And so that means the domestic political environment has to have some kind of configuration, and that's what I mean by we need to reduce the economic policy uncertainty domestically for individual countries, for United States, for Korea. We went through a whole ordeal of this uncertainty. So we can see that should be the first goal. And once we do that, then we still need to address the national security. That issue still remains. I am skeptical about the climate change related industry policy. Those investments were very shaky in how we define it. But when we move away from that and maybe we focus on this reality of future labor force being replaced by robots and automation, and the disappearance of middle class, income inequality, all those things, those should be the long-term focus of these government policies, not this import tariffs or financial grant or subsidies. So I agree with the skepticism. Then we've been agreeing with that for a long time until about 3 years ago. But then everything changed. And so, so maybe it will change again in a few years. But that is the new reality. If that's the new deglobalization, all that thing, then my point again is that we shouldn't react so quickly on this issue. But if everyone is using their government's role and intervention, then South Korea and the US would have to think about different ways to look at it.
Online.
So we have a question from Sarah. It says, does the rise of fragmented national industrial policies risk undermining the coherence and efficiency of GVCs?
Yes, it could. I mean, obviously GVC has, it's also difficult to find GVC. You have the upstream industry, you have downstream industry, you have the forward linkage and
For
backward.
those in the audience who may not know what a GVC is.
Global value chains. So in that, we have the upstream from the raw material to the more of intermediate. Then downstream, more closer to the final good. Then you have this forward linkage and backward linkage. So those things obviously are affected by this fragmentation. And what firms are trying to do is reduce that length, the number of stages that we go through, let's say 2 or 3 or 4 stages to go through from the raw to the final goods. Now we are trying to, the firms are trying to reduce the number. And what I find with my research with my colleague is that we're finding the automation, the new industrial robots are reducing the number of steps. So that's one way we can potentially address that, although with the fragmentation issue, that's beyond what firms can do. And then, especially for the raw materials, that's very difficult. Korea does not have oil. Korea does not have critical minerals that we need. So we need to source that. Geo-fragmentation is going to affect that. But other than that, for the rest of it, that's something that whatever we could control, we should do something about that. Yes.
We have time for one more question. Yes. Mike's coming, sorry.
Thanks. So how does the DMZ figure into the industrial China, Japan, Korea thing? And can we learn anything from the DMZ that would apply to Ukraine problem? And I agree with you on the environmental stuff. That my hometown got $1 billion from New York State for a solar city project. Now Tesla that never made a single panel, and now they're trying to do a green hydrogen plant. They don't have any renewable energy or customers for the hydrogen, or any way to get it to customers if there were via pipeline or anything. So I understand the political thing with the agricultural protectionism, but in wanting to make a stable environment for investors, is the U.S. situation with the Republicans saying they have to win in 2028, or there'll be a big, like a civil unrest?
There's 2 parts of this. So the first part, just so that we're clear, you're asking what and if North Korea contributes to South Korea's industrial policy calculations. Right. And the second part is maybe how sticky might this be post 2028 if we have a new White House government? Yes.
No, if there's another insurrection, except bigger. So I understand you're trying to create political stability to attract investors, and is the potential instability in the U.S. contributing to your desire for your own political stability?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah. So DMZ, I think you mean the demilitarized zone, right? That's what you mean by the North Korea, okay. So in this case, again, this is why U.S. and I'm optimistic about the U.S.-Korea relationship. There is more or less of the issue that we have to address. That's the the strategic alignment with Russia, and China and North Korea, and so we have also the BRICS alliance that's against the United States and the Western world. So then we have to take those factors into consideration. It used to be the case, but then with the current tariff announcements, that's quite difficult to manage that, given how countries are distracted with these issues. And I think moving forward in the next few years, we should have less tariff threats moving forward. And once those negotiations are out of the way, hopefully we see more stability in both countries.
Absolutely. For those of you who want to pester Dr. Lee with more questions, we'll put his email in the show notes. For now, I really want to thank you for a really fascinating conversation, and paper will be coming out in KEI's next edition of Korea Policy, which will be due out in early June. So everybody, thank you.
Thank you.